Okay, go for it.
All right, so I'm going to tell you about my research about confirmation bias and how it applies within politics. So to go in a little bit about confirmation bias, it is defined as people's tendency to look or interpret information that's consistent with their prior belief. So this can come in many ways, and as this graphic demonstrates, so if you're going like not seeking out facts, interpreting the information that you do receive in a different way, only remembering certain details that apply to your prior beliefs, or just completely ignoring anything that challenges your prior belief. And then how does this tie in with politics? So many people do feel very strongly about their political beliefs, and they don't like when their political beliefs are wrong, so they will just completely ignore information that challenges their beliefs. For instance, a quick hypothetical, say a Democrat receives information that disproves their view on immigration, they'll use confirmation bias to completely just not even think about that or use that information to seek out the real truth. So why is this important to research? Confirmation bias hinders a truthful world from being, just hinders a truthful world. So my first study was titled Confirmation Bias Among Adherents of Red and Yellow Politics in Thailand. So red and yellow politics is similar to the American political system. There are two big political parties. So the red shirts were formerly known as the United Front for Democracy, and the yellow shirts were the People's Alliance for Democracy. So these researchers use what they call or they used what's called a PCA. So this determined their participants' previous political beliefs. Then they gave out their participants positive and negative information relating to red and yellow politics. So, for instance, positive information about red politics, positive information about yellow politics, and then negative for both. And then they determined participants' attitudes towards that information. And they concluded that some, but not all, participants exhibited a confirmation bias. So how does this go along with my study? I wanted to give out, X that. Then my second source was titled Peers versus Pros, Confirmation Bias and Selective Exposure to User-Generated versus Professional Media Messages and Its Consequences. So this was a study done by Ohio State researchers, and their participant pool was Ohio State students. So they first got the political beliefs of the Ohio State students, and then they tested whether receiving information from professional sources, so this your normal BBC, Fox, just any reputable source that's out there, versus receiving information from friends, for instance. And they gave this out through headlines. So they gave their participant pool headlines that kind of detail what you would receive or what you'd see online. And contrary to the first study that I just talked about, they found a clear confirmation bias across both peer and professional sources. So this leads me to my study. So both the studies I researched, the first study researched confirmation bias in Thailand among an adult population, and this study did it among college students, and I wanted to examine confirmation bias in a high school demographic, so my research question was, to what extent does confirmation bias correlate with political views in a high school demographic? Going to my method, so I distributed a Google form, and there's different sections within the Google form. I first had my participants take Pew Research Center's political leanings test to gauge where their political leanings were before receiving any information. Second section was just some general questions regarding gun control. For instance, owning a gun keeps me or my family safe, or to what extent do you agree with the Second Amendment? And the next section was a one pro and one con argument taken from procon.org. I used procon.org because I thought any high school student that really reads and takes the time to understand the argument can easily decipher what the argument is, and they should have no trouble really deciding what the argument is. Then the second part of my method is very similar to the first part, just about abortion. So some general questions, like do you consider yourself to be pro-choice or pro-life, or to what extent do you agree with the use of contraceptives? And then my fifth section was one pro and one con argument regarding abortion, also taken from procon.org. And then finally was demographics, just a simple demographics section. So to go on my results, so Pew Research Center, they divide their political groups into 9 different groups, 4 left-leaning, 4 right-leaning, and then 1 in the middle. So left-leaning are progressive lefts, that they're the most left-leaning, and then establishment liberals, democratic mainstays, and then outside of left. The stressed sideliners are the independents, the people that are most centrist, and then the right-leaning, ambivalent right, populist right, committed conservatives, and faith and flag conservatives. Faith and flag being the most right-leaning. I gathered 128 responses, but I only used responses that correctly identified the argument that was given, because if participants were not able to decipher the argument that they were being given, they would not be confirming any bias. So for instance, if one of the establishment liberals did not decipher that the anti-gun control was indeed an anti-gun control, their response was basically just done away with. So my first graph was the pro-legalization of abortion argument, and this was the establishment liberals, so the second most left-leaning group. So there were 10 total establishment liberals out of the 128 total responses, and 9 out of the 10 of them were able to identify this specific argument. 7 of them were very favorable, 2 somewhat favorable, and 1 was neutral. So I would say this does affirm a confirmation bias, since they are left-leaning, and they did decide that they did feel very favorable to the argument, and as we do know today, through our political climate, more left-leaning people are normally more pro-abortion, pro-women's rights, or pro-choice. My next graph was the anti-gun control, but through the outside of left, so this is a slightly left-leaning group. So in total, 23 out of the total 128 people identified themselves as outside of left. Only 15 were able to decipher the argument, and only about half of them felt unfavorable, as I would think, since more left-leaning people are normally more pro-gun control. And the results were very scattered. To my surprise, I did not hypothesize that the outside or left group would be more, I thought more of the outside or left group would be more pro-gun control. And then the ambivalent right, so this is the group that is just slightly right-leaning. So 25 out of the 28 total there are 28 total ambivalent right members, and then 25 of those ambivalent right were able to recognize the pro-abortion argument. And I would say this does affirm a confirmation bias, since they are just slightly right-leaning, and a lot of them answered neutrally, and a big chunk of them did answer somewhat, sorry. I would say this does affirm confirmation bias since a lot of them did answer neutrally and they're just slightly right-leaning. And then the committed conservatives, so this is the group that is not the most right-leaning, second most right-leaning. There were 17 total committed conservatives, and only 7 of them were able to recognize the anti-gun control argument, but they answered very favorably to it, which I would say is a confirmation bias since conservatives do tend to agree with anti-gun control just in the political climate that we live in. So a few limitations. I only gathered 128 responses. I would have liked to gather more, just because that would bolster my argument, but there was no incentive. People don't really care about my research because it doesn't apply to them. That kind of goes along with survey fatigue and how people may not have answered my questions truthfully. I wouldn't say that my survey was too long. It was about 10 to 15 minutes, but still people just don't have any vested interest in the survey, so they may not take the time to really think through the questions and answer it truthfully. And that also goes along with people don't like talking about their political beliefs. They may feel scared to, or just not comfortable. I did explicitly state that the survey is anonymous, but people just may not like putting their political beliefs out there at all. And finally, correlation is not equal causation. This only tells if there is a confirmation bias present or not, and not why or how people use confirmation biases in the real world. So to go into some implications, as I mentioned in my context, confirmation bias does hinder a truthful world, especially in the realm of politics. People aren't accepting the truth. How do we allow the truth to really get out there? And my research study went along with the study of the red and yellow politics, and that there was not a clear confirmation bias, but in some aspects there was. And that could just be because my survey group, our participants attend a Catholic school, so their views on abortion and our gun control could be different, just because the church's teachings on abortion, for instance. And then some further research, I would like to see if my conclusion goes along with is similar to research among different age demographics, because people in my demographic grew up in a world filled with technology. Information is at their fingertips, whereas people in the older generation had to read books, surprisingly, to gather their information. So it would be interesting to see if that had any difference to confirmation bias in the real world. And also, I would like to maybe research the causes or psychology that goes along with confirmation bias. That was one of my limitations, in that my study doesn't tell if confirmation bias or why it's there, but only if it is there. So, final conclusion, right-leaning participants, they had agreement towards the anti-gun control argument, but scattered responses towards the pro-abortion argument. As I said before, this could be because of the church's teaching on abortion. My participants do go to a Catholic school, and that could just cause them to think differently than what most right-leaning people do think, and much differently, the left-leaning participants answered pretty strongly towards the pro-abortion argument. They answered unfavorably as a whole, but they did not answer unfairly towards the anti-gun control argument, as I would have thought. So I would say there was not a clear confirmation bias among my demographic, similar to the red and yellow politics study. There was just a small confirmation bias among some leaders.